I'm Linley Hamilton. I'm a professional trumpet player. I've been playing trumpet since I was 9 years of age. I'm 49 now. My sums means 40 years. And in that time I've been semi-professional since the age of 14, whenever I first started to earn money in a 10-piece show band, just at the end of the show band days. Became a specialist in Dixieland trad jazz, mainstream jazz, got into an Irish youth jazz orchestra, which was very prominent with a lot of the significant players here full time now in Dublin. Led to a lot of contacts whenever I was quite young that enabled me to go into learning processes whenever I was quite young by robbing ideas from other players. In my career I've recorded on 108 albums. I have 5 albums of my own. I have a BBC radio show that's been running for 7 years, a jazz show. I have a first class masters. I didn't have any music qualifications until my first one at the age of 44. I hadn't a grade or an O-level music, just in case this is inspiration for anybody who's thinking about doing this career. I was a civil engineer and studied civil engineering in Queen's, but followed a semi-professional career until I turned pro at about 26, whenever I got the gig with the Commitments, 27 I think it might have been, which was a big movie band, and I did some world tours with them, and then through that led to work with Van Morrison, Paul Brady, Julia Turner, and the McAvoy, younger bands you've heard of, Mojo Fury, So I Watch You From Afar, Foy Vans, Juke Special. Jazz artists like Alan Barnes, Jackie Dankworth from UK, and a lot of the big bands from here, including bands of my own. I have a resident gig in McHugh's in Belfast every Saturday afternoon, 4:30 to 7, and I'm still working internationally with an American singer-songwriter called Joe Johnston, who's a piano player singer, and I've just recorded on Malibu Shark Attack's new album, which has been getting some Radio 1 airplay. So I'm keeping myself visible with the younger audiences by doing that. And I've also got my own career. I'm due to hand in PhD at the end of July in McGee. And then I'll be Dr. Linley Hamilton, hopefully, sometime. That's it.
Okay, Linley. I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions. The first one is, what music first inspired you to play the trumpet? Was there a particular style or genre that interested you?
I've always been interested in music that involves the trumpet, so even whenever I was looking at Top of the Pops in the old days, I'd be looking for trumpet stuff. So stuff like soul music and funk and fusion were things that I really got into. The very first thing I got into obviously were school orchestras and school bands that I played with, and playing that kind of music. I also got into a brass band whenever I was 11, so I was absorbed in that whole thing where trumpet wasn't a subsidiary instrument, it was the main instrument, it was the lead instrument in the brass band, it was the lead instrument in a lot of the concert bands, and it was also the lead instrument in the jazz world. I'd got my first Dixieland jazz record whenever I was 10. It was called At the Jazz Band Ball by a band called the Terry Lightfoot and his Jazz Men, and I must have listened to that hundreds of times. And I just want to qualify one more time, I'm 49, so at 10 years of age there wasn't colour TV. There wasn't a CD player, there wasn't a HD Sony camera, which I'm talking into now, mobile phones or anything like that. There was a black and white TV with 3 channels and a gramophone, and that's what we kind of used. So I had the choice of watching black and white TV or putting these gramophone records on. Whenever I got the records, I played them quite a bit. So Dixieland jazz was my first thing I got into. And very soon I realised that people my age progressed into mainstream and modern jazz, so I had advanced listening techniques, pardon me, from when I was very young. And I'd already started to check out people like Miles Davis by the time I was 15 or 16. Go ahead, sorry.
Who would you say is your favourite trumpeter, and in what ways do you think they influenced your playing style?
It's changed completely. I'd say my favourite trumpeter whenever I was young was Louis Armstrong. Pardon me, sorry about this. I don't know where that came from. My favourite trumpet player whenever I was young was Louis Armstrong, who was the father of Dixieland trad jazz, New Orleans jazz. Very wide sound, big range, powerful vibrato, played the melody, was the lead instrument all the time. Very significant player. But that changed very quickly whenever I got into the mainstream modern jazz stuff. Listened a lot to Miles Davis. I've got 70 of his albums. Fell in love with the music of a trumpet player called Clifford Brown. That was my main influence. He was the first of the bebop players I really got in touch with. Massive technique, very fast bebop lines, very technically proficient, used a lot of bebop language, which was major and minor scales with added chromatic passages maybe between the fourth and the fifth or the sixth and the seventh, or whatever it happened to be. Fifth and the sixth. So it gives you that symmetry whenever you're playing. So bebop players, he was one. He died whenever he was 27 in a car accident way back in the 60s, but he'd already left a legacy with the material he was playing because it was so technically difficult. And very luckily, they had these things called Jamie Aber's old play-alongs, which they still have now, and I purchased a Clifford Brown one and several others, so you're able to learn the melody, read the melody, and play with the rhythm section. You're playing the chords, and then they give you the chords and you solo over the chords. So that was a huge influence. Another trumpet player who was a huge influence at that time, and these two became my main influence for about 10 or 15 years, was Freddie Hubbard. He's also died a few years ago. And Freddie Hubbard was a phenomenal bebop player and modern jazz player, played with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, but also crossed over, did some solo tracks on Billy Joel tracks. Can't remember which one, I think it might have been Zanzibar, I might be wrong on that. Also did a fantastic modern jazz version with a mini orchestra of Christopher Cross's Ride Like the Wind. So this was starting to open up the trumpet into a pop fusion thing that I thought, wow, I didn't know about that. And then of course I got introduced to Steely Dan, who's the greatest band ever, through that connection, etc, etc, etc. But my biggest influence now is a guy called Till Brunner. He's a German, quite unknown trumpet player with an amazing sound. I've been trying to work on his sound, his style of phrasing, his style of articulation. You asked me about the influence, I'll be dead honest with you now. It's so massively influential if you fall in love with another player's music, because you have so many things that you can copy. You can copy their sound, you can copy their tongue, their slur approach, whether they use a d, a t, or a f, or a v, and there are 4 syllables. A lot of trumpet players are taught 1 or 2, but it's actually the jazz ones really are f and v. They're the ones that encourage unvibrated air to go through the horn, which makes it sound so incredible in the ballad or low to mid-register stuff. So Till Brunner would be one of those really fluid players. He's an incredible player, you should check him out. And he'd be my main influence now. I don't know how long that's going to last for, because there's always somebody else who comes along. I don't sound necessarily like Till Brunner. I don't sound necessarily like Ruby Braff, who I spent a lot of time listening to. I don't sound necessarily like Clifford Brown or Freddie Hubbard, but I rob from them. And if you think about what you play, people say that jazz is a language or music is a language. I definitely agree with that. Jazz is a language, music is a language. So what I would say about that is, if you're playing a language, there's 2 things you need. You need vocabulary and you need grammar. Well, vocabulary is the note selection processes that you have over a chord. So if you're taking a solo or playing a melody, that melody is obviously going to fit with the scales over the chord. If you're playing a solo, you're going to be looking at the harmonic choices you make whenever the rhythm section is playing, like a C7 or a G minor 7 or an F major 7, whatever it happens to be. You're going to have implications in the note selection you can choose that's going to sound right. Some of it will sound wrong. So you have that vocabulary choice, and those guys use incredible vocabulary. If you transcribe their solos or buy books of their transcribed solos, you can look at any 4-bar section and see, oh, they've introduced a flat 9 over that 9, or a sharp 9, or a sharp 11, or whatever happens to be. They use language that you wouldn't predict. Well, hey, if it's good enough for them, it's probably good enough for you, so you can use those ideas and practice them yourself. Then there's the grammar. So if we think in terms of grammar, of punctuation, full stops, commas, exclamation marks, phrase marks, indentations at the start of a paragraph, where you have this relationship between space and words, that's the exact same relationship exists between space and music. So if you're playing phrasing, they will have phrasing ideas where they're very fluid. They may be mixed of semigravers and quavers. They're using maybe a lot of triplet action. They may be using triadic phrases, which are phrases which are constructed from a half a tone, tone and a half up to a third, normally, with the odd jump up to a 4th or a 5th, rather than angular phrases. Or maybe they play angular phrases where their consecutive notes are susceptible to large intervallic change of a 4th or more. So you get these ideas from players, you can start practicing them yourself on the horn, and you steal from their vocabulary and grammar until you reinforce your own vocabulary and grammar. The important thing to remember is that I'm 49 in 2014. Clifford Brown died in, I think it might have been even the 50s, early 60s maybe, and Freddie Hubbard, was a big star like in the 80s. that was before they were influenced by the music that we listen to now, and maybe soul music or groove or acid jazz or singer-songwriters like James Taylor, Van Morrison, Carole King, Nick Cave. I mean, incredible musicians with gorgeous approaches to melody and space and time. And if you listen to that, you're bound to play differently. You're bound to be influenced by all the music that's around you. And it's so much easier now to attract that music from downloading from the internet or browsing on Spotify or whatever it happens to be, typing in a name, you've instant access to that. That wasn't the same 40 years ago. So people who studied and practiced in the old days, they were socialised. In other words, you are what you listen to. They were socialised by what they listened to, which was a much narrower confine in terms of the records they get their hands on than it is now.
What trumpeting techniques would you say you've used and developed into your own music now?
It's always changing. I haven't stopped practicing. I'm still practicing every day. I think everything has to relate to the things we've talked about already.
Mm-hmm.
Vocabulary devices and grammar devices, or language devices, which is a combination of the two. I like to divide those into two camps. One is harmonic devices, two is rhythmic devices. So the big ones that you have to do whenever you're starting to play professionally are to do with time and accuracy in terms of pitch choice. So the big things that I would have spent an awful lot of time doing, and still do, to reinforce, are playing the different scale types and playing them so that you're practicing more than one thing at a time. So if you're practicing your major scales in all 12 keys, you know, you play maybe semiquavers starting on, let's say you're doing a C major scale, I would be practicing that starting on beat 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, so the high note, which goes to the ninth, would be on beat 1 of the next bar, which means then the C, which is at the bottom again, is on beat 1 of the next bar. So you have that symmetry if you're practicing. Okay, and I practice my arpeggios again up to the ninth to give that symmetry of 1. Why 1? Because if you're practicing so that your scales resolve rhythmically onto the strongest downbeat, which is 1, then that's how you want to end your phrases. If you're playing solo for jazz, pop, rock or funk or whatever it happens to be, you want to be resolving rhythmically to the downbeat. So you're practicing the scales, you're practicing arpeggios, not just the majors, the Lydian. You're looking at the modes, the Ionian, the Dorian. If you don't know what these are, you can find them online. Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixed Lydian, Aeolian and Locrian. And then you've got the modes of the major harmony, that's what they are. But you've also got the modes of the minor harmony, harmonic minor and melodic minor. So you're practicing your Dorians and you're practicing, you know, those scales again to the 9, to the 1, so the 9 and the 1 fall on the downbeat of beat bar 2 and bar 3, and similarly with the arpeggios, so you have that flexibility. And you've been practicing with a metronome, which is the most important tool that any trumpet player has, is a metronome, because you're not really able to practice with the rhythm section if you're playing with a trumpet. I would say it's probably around about 34 years since I last practiced without a metronome. So I don't practice without a metronome. It just creates too many bad habits. You get a symmetry. If you practice with a metronome, you're practicing 3 things at once, so you're going to be 3 times better than the guy who's not, because you're practicing the things that are related to time. So instead of practicing playing fast, you're practicing playing semiquavers. You're practicing playing quavers at a higher speed, or whatever it happens to be. And if you're using a metronome, you can introduce rests whenever you're playing, so you can try practicing your scales. If you think they're just so easy, you think, oh dear, I don't want to do these scales anymore, you try introducing a quaver rest on the 4th quaver. And leave out the 4th quaver and go into the 5th. You probably try practicing that, and all these other different concepts you can introduce to make sure that you have those totally nailed. And of course they're going ascending, you've got them descending, you've got them ascending, descending, and you've got patterns involving intervallic patterns, so you can do a pattern of 4ths, so you can write these out and you can practice them at different speed using the metronome. Now, why the metronome? Well, you'll probably find that whenever you start playing, you'll be able to play the C scale at 200 beats per minute, but you'll be able to play the F sharp scale at 1 beat per minute. You know, you know what I mean? It's just a wee bit tricky. So the metronome gives you an idea of how much you've improved, because you can write down and you can work and you think, okay, I've now got F sharp and B up to about 46 beats per minute. Oh, I've now got F sharp and B up to 72 beats per minute, and eventually you'll have it up to 150 now. The problem with jazz is that we play what's called multi-key centered music. So the tune's in G, it might only be in G for the first 2 beats, and then you might have a new dominant 7th, and that takes you out of a different key, because the dominant 7 is the 5 of the 1. So you could be in the G, and then all of a sudden you've got an A7 thrown in the second half of the first bar. Well, you're now in D. You're now in D. So that's basically the way it works. It can change as fast as that. So